Hello everyone, I am the Jack Bond Sleep Story and I am here to help you today. I know you used this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The bass pulsed through my body, but it couldn't drown out the panic rising in my chest. I was alone in a sea of strangers, the faces around me blurring into a kaleidoscope of neon, paint and glitter. How could I have lost them so quickly? It was my first time at Dreamscape, one of those massive 3-day music festivals that take over entire fields. My friends had been planning this trip for months and I'd finally caved to their pressure. Come on, Mia, they said, it'll be the experience of a lifetime. Some experience this was turning out to be. I'd only turned away for a second to buy a bottle of water. The crowd had surged forward, swept up in the pulsing rhythm of the headline act, and suddenly my friends were gone. I tried calling their names, but my voice was swallowed by the roar of the music and the cheering crowd as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the festival grounds. A knot of dread formed in my stomach. The once exciting sea of people now felt oppressive closing in around me. I pushed my way through the crowd, muttering "excuse me" and "sorry" as I bumped into sweaty bodies and stepped on toes. I made my way to the edge of the main stage area, hoping for a better vantage point. The festival grounds stretched out before me, a labyrinth of tense food stalls and smaller stages. Colorful flags fluttered in the evening breeze and the air was thick with the smell of fried food and cannabis. "You look lost," a voice said beside me. I turned to see a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. He was wearing a festival staff t-shirt, which immediately put me at ease. I admitted, relief washing over me. "I can't find my friends. We got separated in the crowd." He nodded sympathetically. "That happens a lot here. I'm Jake, by the way. I work security." "Mia," I replied, shaking his outstretched hand. "Do you think you could help me find them?" "Of course," Jake said, his smile widening. "That's what I'm here for. Why don't we head over to the lost and found tent? Sometimes people leave messages there for friends they've lost track of." I followed Jake through the crowd, grateful for his guidance. He moved with confidence, easily navigating the throngs of people. As we walked, he asked me about my friends, their names, what they were wearing, where I'd last seen them. I answered as best I could, my voice nearly drowned out by the music blaring from nearby speakers. We passed food stalls selling overpriced pizza and gyros, art installations that glowed and pulsed with otherworldly light, and circles of people swaying to their own internal rhythms. Under different circumstances I might have found it all magical. Now it just felt overwhelming. "It's just up ahead," Jake said, pointing to a large tent with a lost and found banner. But as we approached, I realized something was off. The tent was dark and there was no one around. "Are you sure this is it?" I asked, hesitating. Jake's hand closed around my wrist, his grip suddenly tight. "Trust me," he said, his voice losing its friendly tone. "I know exactly where we're going." Alarm bells started ringing in my head. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," I demanded, my voice shaking. He ignored me, dragging me towards the tent. I dug my heels into the ground, but the soft earth gave way beneath me. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, his other hand clamped over my mouth. He hissed in my ear, "You don't want to make a scene, do you?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could see people nearby laughing and dancing, completely oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. How could no one notice? Jake pulled me into the dark tent and the sounds of the festival became muffled. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. I could make out shapes, boxes stacked against the walls, at table, chairs. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, Mia, you really shouldn't be so trusting. Pretty girl like you all alone at a big festival like this. You're lucky I found you first." The implications of his words sent a chill down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I stomped hard on his foot, putting all my weight into it. He yelped in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I spun around, my hand connecting with his face in a wild, desperate slap. Jake staggered back, more surprised than hurt. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I bolted for the tent entrance, my heart in my throat. But as I burst out of the tent, I ran straight into someone else. Strong hands gripped my shoulders, steadying me. For a moment I feared it was an accomplice of Jake's, but then I looked up and saw the official security uniform, the walkie-talkie, the stern but concerned expression with her. The security guard said, "Are you all right?" Words tumbled out of me in a rush. "Please, you have to help me. There's a man in there." He said he was security, but he's not. He tried to. I was cut off by Jackie from the tent. His face was composed, but I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. "There you are," he said smoothly. "I was worried when you ran off like that." The security guard looked between us, confusion evident on his face. "What's going on here?" Jake stepped forward, his body language relaxed and open. "I'm so sorry about this. My girlfriend here had a bit too much to drink. I was just trying to get her some water and a place to sit down." I stared at him in disbelief. "He's lying. I don't even know him." The guard's hand went to his radio. "Sir, can I see some ID, please?" Jake's demeanor changed in an instant. He shoved the guard hard, sending him stumbling backwards, then took off running into the crowd. "Stop him," I yelled, but he had already disappeared into the sea of people. The next few hours passed in a blur. More security arrived than the police. I gave my statement over and over, describing Jake and what had happened. They searched the festival grounds, but there was no sign of him. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. I sat wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. The festival continued around me, the music and laughter feeling surreal after what I'd just been through. Mia, Heard a familiar voice call. I looked up to see my friends pushing through the crowd, their faces etched with worry. "Oh my God, we've been looking everywhere for you." As they engulfed me in a group hug, the emotions I'd been holding back finally broke through. I sobbed into their shoulders, relief and fear and leftover adrenaline all pouring out at once. Later, as we sat in our tent, I recounted what had happened. My friends listened in horror, hugging me and assuring me that it wasn't my fault. "I can't believe we let you out of our sight," Sarah said, her voice thick with guilt. I shook my head. "It's not your fault. I'm just glad you found me. We didn't sleep much that night. Every noise outside the tent made me jump, and I kept imagining I saw Jake's face in the shadows, but surrounded by my friends I felt safe for the first time in hours." Here is the next 6000 plus words from your document. "Police from a safe distance and let them handle it, but something kept me there, a sense of responsibility perhaps, or maybe just the stubborn belief that I could handle this on my own." The next day passed in a haze of anxiety and adrenaline. I went through the motions of my daily routine, all while keeping a wary eye on the house next door. The steady stream of cars continued, each visitor staying for exactly 15 minutes before leaving with their small packages. Night fell. I made a decision. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I needed evidence, something concrete I could take to the police, and I knew just where to get it. Waiting until well after midnight, I crept out of the house. The night was eerily quiet, with only the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I made my way across the yard, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it. The old farmhouse loomed before me, dark and forbidding. I circled around to the back, where I'd noticed a partially open window earlier. Taking a deep breath, I hoisted myself up and squeezed through. The smell hit me like a physical force. My eyes watered and my throat burned. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, trying to filter the air, but it didn't help much. I found myself in what must have once been a kitchen. Now it was filled with makeshift lab equipment, beers, hot plates, plastic containers filled with various chemicals. On a table in the corner I saw stacks of cash and bags of a crystalline substance I knew had to be meth. With shaking hands I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The lab set up, the drugs, the money, anything that could serve as evidence. I was so focused on documenting everything that I almost missed the sound of a car pulling up outside. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the kitchen was too exposed. I could hear voices now getting closer. In desperation I dove into a nearby closet, pulling the door shut just as the back door opened through a crack in the door. I watched as two men entered the kitchen. One was the tattooed man who had threatened me earlier. The other was someone I hadn't seen before, older, well-dressed, looking entirely out of place in this dilapidated drug den. "As you can see," Tattoo Man was saying, "production is going smoothly. We should have the next batch ready by Friday." The older man nodded, looking around with an appraising eye. Good, and no problems with the locals?" Tattoo Man hesitated. "Well, there is one small issue. The woman next door, she's been watching the place. I warned her off." But the older man's expression hardened. "But nothing, we can't afford any loose ends. Take care of it." My blood ran cold. "They were talking about killing me." Tattoo Man nodded. "Consider it done." They continued talking, discussing distribution plans and profit margins, but I barely heard them. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I was going to get out of this alive after what felt like an eternity. The two men left. I waited several minutes, listening intently for any sign that they might return before finally emerging from the closet. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk, but somehow I made it back to the window. As I climbed out I heard a shot behind me. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could across the yard and back into my aunt's house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. Then I sank to the floor, my back against the door, and finally let the tears come. When I could breathe again I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before I dialed 911. "Emergency services." "What's your emergency?" I took a deep breath. "I need to report a crime, a big one." The next few hours passed in a blur of police sirens, flashing lights, and endless questions. I watched from the window as the quiet country night erupted into chaos. Police cars swarmed the property next door, officers in tactical gear storming the house. As dawn broke, an officer came to take my statement again. He looked tired but satisfied. "You did good," he told me. "We've been trying to crack this operation for months. Your evidence was the break we needed." I nodded, too exhausted to feel much of anything. "We'll need you to come down to the station later to make a formal statement," he continued, "and you might want to find somewhere else to stay for a while just to be safe." I knew he was right. Even with the main players in custody, there was no guarantee that everyone involved had been caught. I was a loose end, and loose ends had a way of getting tied up permanently in situations like this. As I packed my bags I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. I'd come here looking for a peaceful escape from my hectic life. Instead I'd walked right into the biggest adventure and the biggest danger I'd ever faced. I took one last look around the quaint farmhouse, now forever changed. In my eyes the smell of chemicals still lingered in the air, a reminder of how quickly the illusion of safety can be shattered. As I drove away, leaving behind the flashing lights and crime scene tape, I realized something: life doesn't always give you what you expect. Sometimes it throws you into the deep end, forcing you to sink or swim, and sometimes you surprise yourself with just how well you can swim when you have to. I may not have gotten the relaxing vacation I'd hoped for, but I'd gotten something else, a reminder of my own strength and the knowledge that even in the darkest situations there's always a choice to do the right thing. Here is the next 6000 plus words from your document. Return to normal, but I never forgot that night. It taught me something important about myself, that when pushed to the edge I had the courage to stand up for what was right. It was a hard lesson, one that could have cost me dearly, but it also showed me a strength I didn't know I possessed. Now years later I still think about those men. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there terrorizing other late night diners or unsuspecting women, but I also think about that young woman at the counter and how a simple act of standing up to bullies might have saved her from something terrible. I may not work the night shift anymore, but I carry that experience with me. It reminds me that even in the darkest moments we have a choice. We can give in to fear, or we can find the courage to stand up for ourselves and others. It's not always easy, and it's certainly not always safe, but in the end it's what defines us. And me, I choose to be the person who stands up no matter how scary the night may seem. The moment I saw his eyes in my rear view mirror, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. They weren't the eyes of someone coming to help, they were the eyes of a predator who just found his prey, and I was trapped on a deserted highway with him, miles from anywhere. It had started as a simple road trip. I was driving cross country to start a new job, my car packed with everything I owned, the freedom of the open road, the promise of a fresh start. It all felt like an adventure, until my car started making a worrying noise. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, I'd been driving for hours, the landscape an endless sea of wheat fields under a vast empty sky. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in brilliant oranges and pinks. When I first heard the rattling, it started soft, barely noticeable over the hum of the engine and the radio, but as the miles ticked by it grew louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it. At first I was on a tight schedule, and the thought of being delayed by car trouble made my stomach churn. But when white smoke started billowing from under the hood, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. Cursing under my breath, I eased the car onto the shoulder. The rattling had become a full-blown clatter, and the engine gave one final sputtering cough before dying completely. Great, just great. I got out, popping the hood and waving away the accurate smoke. I didn't know much about cars, but even I could tell this was bad. The engine was a mess of hoses and metal, all looking equally foreign and unhelpful. I was way out of my depth. Sighing, I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course, the sun had dipped below the horizon now, the twilight deepening rapidly in the gathering darkness. The empty highway suddenly felt a lot less peaceful and a lot more menacing. I shivered, though the evening was still warm. That's when I saw the headlights approaching. My heart leapt. Maybe this wasn't a disaster after all. I waved my arms, feeling a rush of relief as the car, an old pickup truck, slow and pulled over behind me. A man got out, tall and broad-shouldered. In the dim light I could make out a scruffy beard and a worn baseball cap. He approached with an easy smile. Car trouble? He asked, his voice a deep rumble. I nodded, gesturing helplessly at the smoking engine. It just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about cars, he chuckled. Maybe a thing or two. Mind if I take a look? I stepped aside, watching as he leaned over the engine. He poked and prodded, muttering to himself. After a few minutes he straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. Well, the good news is it's not unfixable, he said. Bad news is you're going to need a part. One don't have on me. There's a town about 30 miles up the road with an auto shop. I could give you a ride if you want. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed that getting into a car with a stranger on a deserted highway was a bad idea, but what choice did I have? I couldn't stay here all night, and who knew when another car might come along? That would be great. Thank you, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I really appreciate it. He smiled again, but this time something about it made my skin crawl. Happy to help. Grab what you need and hop in. I quickly grabbed my purse and phone from my car, locking it out of habit, as if anyone would steal it out here. The man was already in his truck, engine idling. I climbed into the passenger seat, the old springs creaking under my weight. I'm John, by the way, he said as he pulled back onto the highway. Sarah, I replied, buckling my seatbelt. Thanks again for stopping. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. It's dangerous out here for a young woman all alone. Never know what kind of people you might run into. Something in his tone made me glance over sharply. His face was half in shadow, but I could see a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile. An uncomfortable silence fell. I found myself wishing he'd turn on the radio, anything to break the growing tension, but the only sound was the rumble of tires on asphalt and my own heartbeat, which seemed to be getting louder by the second. So I said, desperate to fill the silence, do you live around here? John shook his head. Not just passing through like you. Oh, where are you headed? He turned to look at me then, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights his eyes seemed to glitter with something dark and hungry. Wherever the road takes me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to look out the window, trying to hide my growing unease. The landscape outside was pitch black now, no signs of life or civilization anywhere. We could have been the only two people left in the world. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. We'd been driving for at least 20 minutes, but the odometer hadn't budged. We weren't going towards town, we were going in circles. John, the first said, my voice shaking slightly. I think we might have missed a turn or something. Shouldn't we have reached the town by now? He didn't respond, just kept driving, that small unsettling smile still on his face. John the first said again, louder this time, did you hear me? We need to turn around. In one swift motion he reached over and locked the doors. The sound of the locks clicking into place was like a gunshot in the quiet cab. Now Sarah, he said his voice low and menacing. Why would I want to do that? We're just getting to know each other. Panic surged through me. This couldn't be happening. This was the stuff of nightmares, of cautionary tales. This didn't happen in real life, not to me, but it was happening, and I knew with terrifying certainty that if I didn't do something right now I might not live to see morning. I glanced around frantically looking for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My purse was at my feet. Inside was a small canister of pepper spray my mom had insisted I carry if I could just reach it without him noticing. Here is the next 6000 plus words from your document. Could call for help, but in my panic I'd lost my bearings. Nothing looked familiar. I was running blind, driven purely by the need to get away. Another shot closer. This time I felt something hot graze my arm and looked down to see a tear in my jacket, blood welling up from a shallow cut. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. These men were going to kill me if they caught me. I burst through a thicket and found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. Far below I could hear the rush of a river. It sounded both threatening and inviting. I had two choices: stay and fight, knowing I wouldn't win, or jump and take my chances with the water. Without thinking I took a running start and leapt into the void. The fall seemed to last forever, the wind rushing past me, a scream tearing from my throat. I hit the water hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs and sending pain lancing through my body. The current grabbed me, immediately pulling me under, tumbling me head over heels. As I struggled to orient myself, I broke the surface, gasping for air, only to be pulled under again. Rocks scraped against my skin and my muscles screamed in protest, but somehow I managed to stay afloat. The men didn't follow me into the water, at least not right away. I caught glimpses of them on the ravine edge, their angry voices barely audible over the roar of the river, but the current carried me away quickly, taking me out of their line of sight and into the unknown. The next few hours were a blur of cold water and desperate survival. I clung to anything I could find: drifting logs, pieces of debris, anything that might keep me afloat. By the time the river spat me out onto a rocky bank, I was utterly spent. I lay there coughing and shivering, too weak to move for what felt like hours. When I finally managed to sit up, the reality of my situation hit me. I was alone in the wilderness, injured and without supplies. The men who'd been chasing me might still be looking, and I had no way of knowing if I was closer to safety or further from it. I took stock of my injuries: a few bruises and scrapes, nothing too serious, but my arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed me. The wound was shallow but still bleeding, and I had nothing to clean or bandage it with. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since early that morning. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle protesting the movement, and started walking, following the river downstream. It was my best chance of finding civilization. As I stumbled through the forest, my mind kept replaying the events of the past day: the men, the grave, the chase. It all seemed surreal, like a bad dream. I kept expecting to wake up safe and sound in my tent, but the pain and cold were constant reminders that this was all too real. By nightfall I was exhausted and no closer to finding help. I found a hollow under a large tree and crawled inside, huddling against the cold. I tried to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep in these conditions could be dangerous, but my body had other ideas. I drifted off to the sound of the river and the distant cries of animals. I woke to sunlight streaming through the trees and the sound of rushing water, stronger now than it had been the night before. I followed the sound and found myself at the edge of a waterfall, the river plunging into a deep pool below. It was beautiful in a way, but also daunting. There was no way to climb down safely, and the forest on either side was dense and unforgiving. I had no choice but to backtrack and find another way around. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice, faint and distant. My heart leapt at the sound. I wasn't alone. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing through the forest. Is anyone there? For a moment there was no response, then the voice came again, closer this time. Help me please. The voice was weak but unmistakable, a man's voice. I pushed through the undergrowth, moving towards the sound, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and apprehension. Finally I found him, a man lying on the ground near the river's edge. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as I approached, his eyes filled with relief. Thank God, he murmured. I wasn't sure anyone would find me. What happened? I asked, kneeling beside him. He grimaced, shifting slightly. A bear, he said, barely got away, but my leg, it's broken. His leg was indeed in bad shape, swollen and bent at an unnatural angle. He was lucky to be alive. I didn't have much to offer, but I did what I could, tearing strips from my jacket to create a makeshift splint and offering him sips of water from the river. We need to get you out of here, I said, but he shook his head. Can't walk, he muttered, voice weak. You need to go get help. I hesitated, torn between the urge to stay and help him and the need to find help for both of us. Finally I made a decision. I can't just leave you here, I said firmly. I'll find something to make a stretcher or maybe a branch to support you. The man looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. You don't even know me, he said. Why are you helping? I shrugged. Because it's the right thing to do. Besides, I added with a faint smile, you might be my ticket out of here. He chuckled, then winced at the pain. You're a strange one, he said, but thank you. Here is the next 6000 plus words from your document. Like a sprawling criminal enterprise, I realized then the true weight of what I'd inherited. This wasn't just a house and some mysterious business dealings. This was evidence that could bring down some very powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened them. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't run. Frank had made it clear I was being watched. I couldn't go to the police who knew how deep this corruption ran. There was only one thing I could do. I spent the next few days going through every inch of the house, cataloging the evidence Frank had left behind. There were ledgers detailing every transaction, receipts from offshore accounts, photographs implicating well-known figures in illegal activities. It was overwhelming and terrifying, but it was also a lifeline. If anything happened to me, this evidence would ensure the truth came out. I compiled everything onto a flash drive and hid it in the one place I knew no one would think to look: a hollowed-out section of the baseboard in the upstairs hallway. Then I waited. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for me, for the evidence, for the secrets Frank had been trying to keep buried, and when they did, I needed to be ready. It started small. Strange cars parked on my street, men in suits watching from across the road. At first I thought I was imagining it, paranoia creeping in after everything that had happened, but then the calls started late at night, always from unknown numbers. Silence on the other end. When I answered, it was clear someone wanted me to know I was being watched, but instead of scaring me into submission, it only steeled my resolve. I couldn't let Frank's death be in vain. I couldn't let these people get away with what they'd done. I started leaving the house only for necessities, sticking to crowded places where I felt safer. I kept a low profile, but I knew it wouldn't last. They would come for me eventually, and I needed a plan, so I did what Frank had always taught me to do. I prepared. I installed additional locks on the doors and windows, reinforced the basement door, and set up a series of security cameras around the property. I even took a self-defense class, though I knew it was little match for the kind of threat I was facing. Then one night it happened. I woke to the sound of glass shattering somewhere downstairs. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept towards the noise. My security cameras were routed to a monitor in my room, and a quick glance showed two men dressed in black moving through the living room, their faces obscured by masks. I dialed 911, whispering the situation to the dispatcher and praying help would arrive in time. Then I took a deep breath and prepared to confront them. I positioned myself at the top of the stairs, bat in hand, adrenaline coursing through me as I listened to their movements. They were searching for something, overturning furniture, rifling through drawers. It didn't take a genius to figure out what they were after. I waited until one of them started up the stairs before making my move, swinging the bat with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud and the man crumpled to the ground. His partner shouted in alarm, turning towards me, but I was already retreating, locking myself in the bedroom and pushing furniture against the door. My hands trembled as I watched the monitor. The second man was helping his friend to his feet, both of them retreating. The sound of sirens in the distance must have spooked them. I stayed in the bedroom until the police arrived, only emerging when I was certain it was safe. The officers swept the house, taking my statement and promising to increase patrols in the area, but I knew this wasn't over. The men had been professionals. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every noise and second-guessing every stranger who crossed my path. It was no way to live, but it was the price I had to pay for doing the right thing. And then one day the calls stopped, the cars disappeared, and the men in suits were nowhere to be seen. At first I thought it was a trick, a lull to make me lower my guard, but as the weeks turned into months it became clear that whoever had been watching me had moved on. I was safe for now, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with me. I decided to leave the city, selling the house and using the money to start over somewhere new. I kept the flash drive with me, a constant reminder of the secrets I'd uncovered and the danger they represented. I knew I'd never truly be free of it, but at least I could try to build a new life away from the shadows of my uncle's legacy. As I settled into my new home, far from the chaos and danger I'd left behind, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time in months I could breathe again, sleep without fear of someone breaking down my door. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was mine, and for now that was enough. The flash drive remained hidden, a silent promise that the truth would come out if anyone tried to hurt me again. It was a weight I carried willingly, knowing that doing the right thing often came at a cost. But as I looked out at the horizon, the sun setting in a blaze of color, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The darkness might always be there, lurking at the edges of my vision, but as long as I kept moving forward, I knew I could face whatever came next. The forest was eerily silent as I made my way back to the cabin, the fading light casting long shadows through the trees. It had been a long day of hiking and I was looking forward to a hot meal and a good night's sleep, but as I approached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the door. It was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I knew I'd locked it before I left. My heart sank as I realized what that meant. Someone had been here, or worse, they were still here. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still and quiet, too quiet. Swallowing my fear, I stepped cautiously towards the cabin, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot sounding impossibly loud in the silence. As I reached the door, I paused, listening for any sound from within, but there was nothing. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The cabin was a mess: furniture overturned, drawers pulled open, and there Contents scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had been searching for something, but what could they possibly want here? This was a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing valuable, nothing worth stealing. As I stepped further inside, I felt a sense of unease growing stronger with each passing moment. There was an energy in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw it scrawled across the wall in what looked like charcoal was a single word: leave. My blood ran cold as I stared at the message, the implications sinking in. Whoever had done this wasn't just a random thief. They wanted me gone, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to make it happen. I turned to leave, intending to call the authorities as soon as I had a signal, but as I reached the door I heard it, a soft whisper barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. Leave. The word sent a jolt of fear through me. I spun around searching for the source, but there was no one there. The cabin was empty save for me and the mess left behind. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed out of the cabin, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to get to my car and drive away as fast as possible. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me as I ran towards the trail that led back to the parking area. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting twisted shadows in the dim light. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig sent my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the woods. I reached the car with a sense of relief, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door and climbed inside. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the trail, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their gaze locked on me. I didn't wait to see if they would come closer. Slamming the car into gear, I sped down the dirt road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The figure disappeared from view, but the sense of unease lingered. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the dark forest replaced by open fields and the faint glow of distant streetlights. As I pulled into a gas station to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one else there, just the empty parking lot and the flickering neon sign above the convenience store. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after the events of the day, but deep down I knew better. Something had happened in that cabin, something I couldn't explain, and as I continued my journey home I couldn't help but feel that whatever it wasn't finished with me yet. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night, the whisper in the cabin, the figure in the woods. It haunts me in my dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Here is the next 6,000 plus words from your document. My cabin, my mind racing. Should I report what I'd seen? But what if I was wrong? I didn't want to cause a panic over nothing. I decided to keep an eye on the situation and only say something if I saw anything else suspicious. As night fell, the storm intensified. The ferry creaked and groaned as it plowed through increasingly large waves. Most passengers had retreated to their cabins or the main lounge, seeking refuge from the wind and rain lashing the decks. Unable to sleep, I made my way to the lounge. It was mostly empty save for a few passengers dozing in chairs and the night clerk flipping through a magazine. I sat by a window watching the storm rage outside, the rain streaking across the glass in chaotic patterns. As I stared into the darkness, my thoughts kept returning to the man and the package. What was so important that it had to be delivered in the middle of the night in this weather, and why had he seemed so on edge? The more I thought about it, the more I felt that something wasn't right. And then I saw him again. The man was standing in the doorway of the lounge, his coat dripping wet and his eyes scanning the room. When his gaze landed on me, I quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in the storm, but I could feel his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he moved on. My heart raced as I debated what to do. Should I confront him, report him to the crew, or simply wait and see what happened next? Before I could decide, he left the lounge, disappearing down the corridor towards the cabins. I stood hesitating for a moment before following him, my curiosity getting the better of me. The corridor was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering slightly with the motion of the ferry. I moved quietly, trying to keep my footsteps muffled by the carpeted floor. The man stopped outside a cabin, knocking softly before slipping inside. I crept closer, pressing myself against the wall as I tried to hear what was happening inside. Muffled voices reached my ears, tense and hurried. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a smuggling operation, an exchange of stolen goods, or something even more sinister? My heart pounded as I weighed my options. I could burst in and confront them, but that seemed like a good way to get myself hurt, or worse, I could go to the crew, but without any solid evidence, would they even take me seriously? Before I could decide, my decision was made for me. The door opened suddenly and the man stepped out, his eyes narrowing as they landed on me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but my mind went blank. I thought I heard someone in trouble. I finally managed to say. He didn't look convinced, his gaze flicking to the door behind him and then back to me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, taking a step closer. "Go back to your cabin and forget you saw anything." His tone brooked no argument. But as I Turned to leave, I couldn't help glancing back at the door, my curiosity outweighing my fear. I caught a glimpse of the package on the table inside the cabin, partially unwrapped, revealing what looked like a stack of cash and something metallic. A gun. My blood ran cold as I hurried down the corridor, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. I needed to tell someone, but who would believe me? I was just a passenger on this ferry, not a detective or a hero. As I reached my cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat on the bed, my hands shaking. What had I gotten myself into? The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling and the rain pounding against the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm in my mind. I knew I couldn't let this go. Whatever was happening on this ferry, it was dangerous, and I had unwittingly stumbled into the middle of it, but the question remained, what was I going to do about it? Here's a continuation of the story from where it left off. I sat on the bed, heart pounding as the storm raged on outside. The sound of rain hammering against the window seemed almost soothing compared to the chaos in my mind. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to think logically. Whatever was happening on this ferry was dangerous, but running blindly into it wouldn't help. I grabbed a notepad from my bag and began jotting down everything I had observed: the man with the package, the suspicious exchange, the money, the gun. My instincts told me to involve the crew, but the memory of the man's cold, threatening gaze stopped me. What if he had allies? What if the crew were complicit? Then came a sound that made me freeze, a knock at the door. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The knock came again, soft and deliberate. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound calm. No answer. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, and crept toward the door. Another knock, louder this time, echoed through the room. Slowly, I leaned against the door, peering through the peephole. My stomach dropped. It was him. The man stood just outside, his face shadowed under the dim light of the hallway. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was tense. I considered not answering, pretending I wasn't here, but before I could act, he spoke. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice muffled but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Open the door. We need to talk." Talk? What could he possibly want? My grip on the flashlight tightened as I debated my options. I could stay silent and hope he went away, or I could face him head on. Neither option felt particularly safe. "I don't know what you're talking about," I finally called out, trying to buy time. A low chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Let's not play games. You've been snooping around where you shouldn't. Open the door, and maybe we can work something out." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where would I go? I was trapped on this ferry in the middle of a storm. "Go away!" I shouted, trying to mask the panic in my voice. The man sighed, and then came a sound that made my blood turn to ice, the subtle scrape of metal against wood. He was trying to force the lock. Adrenaline surged through me, and I sprang into action. I grabbed my phone, dialing the ship's emergency line as I pressed my shoulder against the door to brace it. The line rang endlessly. Come on," I whispered, my voice frantic. The door shook under the force of the man's attempts to break in. I backed away, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Suddenly, the line connected, and a calm, detached voice answered. "Emergency desk. How can I assist?" "Someone's trying to break into my cabin." I hissed. "I'm in room 304. Please, send help." The call cut off. I stared at my phone in disbelief. No signal. The storm must have interrupted the connection. The door groaned under another impact. I had no choice. I grabbed my bag, stuffing the notepad and flashlight inside, and headed toward the small porthole window. It was barely large enough to squeeze through, but it was my only way out. The storm's icy wind whipped my face as I pushed the window open and clambered onto the narrow ledge outside. Rain lashed against me as the ferry rocked violently with the waves. Below me was nothing but churning black water. The door burst open just as I swung my legs out of the window. The man stormed into the cabin, his eyes widening when he saw me outside. "Get back here," he shouted, lunging toward the window. But I was already moving, inching along the slick ledge toward the next cabin. My heart pounded in my ears as the wind threatened to knock me off balance. I didn't dare look down. The man leaned out of the window, reaching for me, but I was just out of his grasp. He cursed loudly, and then I heard him retreat, his heavy boots stomping toward the hallway. I reached the next cabin window and banged on the glass, praying someone was inside. A startled face appeared, a middle-aged woman who looked just as terrified as I felt. "Please, let me in," I shouted over the storm. She hesitated for a moment, then unlatched the window and helped me climb inside. I collapsed onto the floor, drenched and gasping for air. "What's going on?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "There's a man, he's dangerous," I said between breaths. "He's after me." Her eyes widened in fear, but before she could respond, the door to her cabin burst open. It wasn't the man, it was someone else. A crew member. "What's going on in here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between me and the terrified woman. "Please," I said, scrambling to my feet. "You have to help me. There's a man trying to kill me. He's..." The crew member raised a hand to stop me. "Calm down," he said. "We'll handle it. Come with me." I hesitated, glancing back at the woman. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the bed. I didn't trust this man, but I didn't have much of a choice. "Fine," I said, following him into the hallway. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking straight into a trap. The hallway was eerily quiet, save for the creaking of the ferry as it struggled against the storm. My steps felt heavier with every passing second, doubt creeping into my mind. The crew member walked ahead of me, his posture rigid. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of rain pounding against the ship's exterior. "Security office," he replied curtly, not turning back. The logical part of me wanted to believe him. Surely the ferry's security team would be able to handle the situation, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Something felt off about his demeanor, too cold, too indifferent. As we turned a corner, I noticed something strange. Instead of heading toward the heart of the ship, where I assumed the security office would be, we were moving toward a more secluded part of the ferry. The corridors here were narrower, dimly lit, and completely deserted. I slowed my pace, my instincts screaming at me to stop. "This doesn't feel right," I said, my voice trembling. The man finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "We're almost there. Don't worry." But I did worry. Every fiber of my being told me to run. And then I saw it, the subtle movement of his hand reaching toward something at his belt. A flash of metal. Without thinking, I bolted. "Hey!" he shouted, his footsteps pounding behind me. I sprinted down the corridor, my wet shoes slipping on the polished floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned corner after corner, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us. A heavy thud behind me told me he had tripped or slipped. It was the only chance I'd get. I rounded a final corner and found myself in a stairwell. Without hesitation, I climbed, each step a battle as my legs burned with exertion. I burst onto the top deck, the storm hitting me like a wall. Wind whipped my hair into my face, and rain stung my skin like needles. The deck was deserted, the storm too fierce for anyone to brave it willingly. But I had no choice. I scanned my surroundings, searching for any place to hide. The lifeboats were too exposed, and the deck's layout left few options. My eyes landed on a storage closet tucked against the far wall. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I darted toward it, yanking the door open and slipping inside just as I heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell. The closet was cramped, filled with cleaning supplies and tools, but it offered enough space for me to crouch out of sight. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps grew louder. "Where are you?" the man's voice called out, barely audible over the storm. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. The pounding of my heart was deafening, drowning out all rational thought. The footsteps moved closer. Closer. I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out as the door handle rattled. The door didn't open. "She couldn't have gone far," the man muttered to himself. His voice faded as his footsteps moved away, swallowed by the howling wind. I waited, counting the seconds, until I was sure he was gone. Then, cautiously, I opened the door just enough to peek outside. The deck was empty. For now. I slipped out of the closet, my body trembling from adrenaline and the cold. I needed to find help, real help. Staying on the ferry was no longer an option. I had to figure out a way to signal for rescue or alert the authorities before it was too late. My mind raced as I moved toward the edge of the deck, scanning the horizon. The storm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The vast, churning ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no solace. And then I saw it, a faint glimmer in the distance. A ship. Hope surged through me. If I could signal them, maybe they'd see me. Maybe they'd help. I searched the deck for something, anything, that could catch their attention. My eyes landed on a flare gun mounted near one of the lifeboats. I sprinted toward it, my soaked clothes clinging to my skin and the wind threatening to knock me off my feet. My fingers fumbled as I unlatched the casing and grabbed the flare gun. Just as I turned to aim it at the distant ship, a hand grabbed my arm. I screamed, twisting violently to break free, but the grip was ironclad. It was the man from the hallway, his face twisted in anger. "You just couldn't mind your own business, could you?" he snarled. I struggled against him, raising the flare gun with my free hand. Before he could react, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out in a blinding burst of light and heat, narrowly missing his face. He stumbled back, releasing me as he shielded his eyes. I didn't wait. I ran to the edge of the deck, waving my arms and screaming toward the distant ship. "Help! Over here!" The flare arced high into the stormy sky, a fiery beacon cutting through the darkness. Behind me, the man recovered, his heavy footsteps closing in. But it was too late. A spotlight from the distant ship illuminated the ferry, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a horn blaring through the storm. Relief washed over me as I realized they had seen me. Help was coming. The man lunged for me again, but this time, I was ready. I ducked, using his momentum against him. He stumbled forward, his feet slipping on the rain-slicked deck. With a final, desperate shove, I sent him sprawling onto the ground. Moments later, a rescue boat was launched from the approaching ship, cutting through the waves toward the ferry. I collapsed onto the deck, tears mingling with the rain as the weight of the night finally caught up to me. I was safe. For now. The rescue boat cut through the waves with practiced precision, its engine roaring over the howling wind. As it drew closer, I saw figures on board, crew members clad in rain gear, their faces set with determination. The beam of their spotlight swept across the ferry deck, illuminating the chaos around me. I stumbled toward the edge of the deck, waving my arms to ensure they saw me. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but the sight of the rescue team gave me a surge of hope. Behind me, the man struggled to his feet, his face twisted in fury. He reached into his coat, and my heart sank as I saw the glint of metal. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice raw from the cold and fear. The rescue boat crew must have seen the commotion because one of them raised a megaphone. "Step away from her. We are armed and will use force if necessary." The man hesitated, his grip on the weapon faltering. For the first time, doubt crossed his face. He glanced between me and the rescue crew, clearly calculating his next move. "Let it go," one of the crew members shouted. "This is over." For a moment, it seemed like he might comply. But then, with a snarl, he turned and sprinted toward the opposite end of the deck, disappearing into the storm. I collapsed to my knees, relief coursing through me as the rescue boat finally pulled alongside the ferry. A ladder was lowered, and one of the crew members climbed aboard. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling beside me. "And no," I stammered, though my entire body ached. "There's a man, he's dangerous. He's still on the ferry." The crew member nodded, his expression grim. "We'll take care of it. Let's get you off this ship." He helped me to my feet, and together, we made our way to the rescue boat. The ladder swayed dangerously in the wind, but I gripped it tightly, climbing down one step at a time. When I finally reached the boat, strong hands pulled me aboard, wrapping me in a blanket. The moment my feet touched the deck, a wave of exhaustion hit me. My knees buckled, and I sank onto a bench, shivering uncontrollably. "You're safe now," one of the crew members said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We'll get you back to our ship and figure out what's going on." I nodded weakly, too drained to respond. As the rescue boat sped away from the ferry, I couldn't help but glance back. The massive ship loomed in the darkness, its lights flickering like distant stars. Somewhere on that ferry, the man who had terrorized me was still at large. But I was alive. For now, that was enough. On the larger rescue vessel, I was ushered into a warm, brightly lit cabin where a medic checked me over. My injuries were minor scrapes, bruises, and the beginnings of hypothermia, but the emotional toll was far greater. "You're lucky we spotted your flare," the medic said, wrapping a blanket more tightly around my shoulders. "What happened out there?" I hesitated, unsure where to begin. The events of the night felt like a fever dream, fragmented and surreal. Finally, I took a deep breath and told them everything: the suspicious man, the package, the gun, and the chase through the storm. The crew listened intently, their expressions growing darker with every word. "We'll notify the authorities," the captain said when I finished. "They'll intercept the ferry and apprehend anyone involved. You've done the right thing." His words were meant to comfort, but they brought little relief. The image of the man's cold, predatory gaze was burned into my memory. Hours later, I stood on the deck of the rescue ship, watching as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving the ocean calm and endless. A hand rested lightly on my shoulder, and I turned to see one of the crew members, a woman with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "You're going to be okay," she said. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed her. For now, I was safe. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The man on the ferry, the mysterious package, the web of danger I had stumbled into, it was all far from resolved. As the ship headed toward the nearest port, I resolved to do whatever it took to protect myself and uncover the truth. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. The port city loomed on the horizon, its lights shimmering in the early morning haze. As the rescue ship pulled closer, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. While the safety of land was a welcome sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into an even more complicated web of danger. The captain had assured me that the authorities would be waiting to question me and investigate the events aboard the ferry. Still wrapped in my blanket, I braced myself as the ship docked, its crew bustling to secure the vessel. A small group of uniformed officers waited at the pier. As I stepped off the ship, their leader, a tall man with a stern face, approached me. "You must be Ms. Carter," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm Detective Harris. We've been briefed on what happened. Let's get you somewhere safe to talk." I nodded, too tired to do much else. They led me to an unmarked car, its interior warm and quiet compared to the chaos of the past night. The ride to the station was short, but my mind raced with questions. What would happen to the man on the ferry? Who was he working for? And what was in that package that made it worth risking everything? At the station, they brought me to a small interview room. Detective Harris sat across from me, a notebook in hand. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Don't leave anything out." I recounted the night's events for what felt like the 100th time, starting with the man I'd seen in the lounge and ending with the desperate flare signal. Harris listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This man you described," he said. "You're sure he was carrying a gun?" "Positive," I replied. "I saw it in the cabin during the exchange. There was also money, lots of it." Harris nodded, his jaw tightening. "We've already dispatched officers to intercept the ferry. If your story checks out, this could be part of something much bigger than you realize." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Bigger? What do you mean?" Harris hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed. "We've been tracking a smuggling ring operating along the coast," he said. "Drugs, weapons, sometimes even people. If this man is involved, you might have stumbled onto a key piece of the puzzle."
I swallowed hard, the weight of his statements sinking in. So, what happens now?
Now, you stay under our protection, Harris said firmly. If these people realize you've seen too much, they won't hesitate to come after you.
We'll keep you safe until we've apprehended everyone involved.
The gravity of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. My ordinary life had been upended in a single night, and now I was a potential target in a dangerous game. Harris must have seen the fear in my eyes because his tone softened.
You did the right thing by signaling us. We'll make sure you're safe.
Despite his reassurance, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that safety was an illusion. These were people who operated in shadows, who would go to any lengths to protect their secrets.
The next few days passed in a blur.
The authorities relocated me to a safe house, a nondescript apartment in a quiet neighborhood. 2 officers were stationed outside at all times, and I wasn't allowed to leave without an escort.
Despite the precautions, I felt far from secure.
Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window sent my heart racing.
On the 3rd day, Harris visited me with an update.
We intercepted the ferry, he said, taking a seat across from me at the small kitchen table. The man you described wasn't aboard.
My stomach dropped. What? How is that possible? He must have abandoned ship before we got there, Harris said grimly.
But we found evidence, cash, weapons, and a ledger detailing their operations. It's enough to make arrests, but the man you encountered is still out there. I slumped back in my chair, the knot in my stomach tightening.
So, what now? We're expanding the search, Harris said.
But until we catch him, you need to stay vigilant. If he knows you're the one who exposed him, he might come after you. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. I nodded, though fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. As Harris left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man from the ferry was still out there, and as long as he was, I would never truly be safe. The days in the safe house stretched into an uneasy routine. Each morning, I woke to the sound of the officers shifting shifts outside the door. Each night, I stared out the window, searching the shadows for signs of the man who had haunted my thoughts since the ferry. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by nightmares of the storm, the chase, and his piercing gaze.
Every creak in the apartment set my nerves on edge. The safe house felt anything but safe.
A week later, Harris returned with more news. We've arrested several suspects connected to the smuggling ring, he said, settling into the chair across from me.
They're talking, giving us more names and details about the operation. It's a significant breakthrough. Did they mention the man from the ferry?
I asked, my voice tight with anxiety.
Harris hesitated before answering. Not yet.
But we're getting closer. I bit my lip, frustration bubbling to the surface.
How can you be sure? He's out there, and he knows I'm a threat. What if he finds me before you find him?
Harris leaned forward, his tone firm.
We're doing everything we can to protect you. I need you to trust us.
Trust was a tall order. Every day that passed without his capture felt like a countdown to disaster. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a noise jolted me upright.
It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the heater, but it was enough to set my pulse racing.
I strained to listen, holding my breath. The sound came again, a soft scraping, like metal against wood. My heart thudded in my chest as I climbed out of bed, grabbing the lamp from the nightstand as a makeshift weapon.
I crept toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the carpeted floor. The scraping grew louder. It was coming from the front door. I froze, my mind racing. The officers outside should have stopped anyone from approaching. Unless. A loud crash shattered the silence as the door burst open, splinters flying.
A dark figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. It was him. Before I could react, he lunged toward me, his movements quick and deliberate. I swung the lamp, but he dodged easily, grabbing my wrist and twisting it until I dropped the makeshift weapon.
Did you really think you could hide? He growled, his voice cold and venomous.
I struggled against his grip, panic overtaking me. My screams echoed through the apartment as he dragged me toward the door. Suddenly, a shout came from outside.
"Police! Drop her and get on the ground."
The man hesitated, his grip tightening as he weighed his options. The officers burst into the room, their weapons drawn, and in the chaos, he shoved me to the ground and bolted. I scrambled to my feet as the officers gave chase, their voices echoing down the hallway. My entire body shook as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath.
Minutes later, one of the officers returned, his expression grim. "He got away."
The weight of those words crushed me.
He was still out there, still hunting me.
The attack changed everything. Harris arranged for me to be moved to a new safe house, this one even more secure than the last. The officers who had been guarding me were replaced with a larger team, and I was given strict instructions not to leave under any circumstances. Despite the increased precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a warning. Harris visited often, updating me on the investigation and trying to reassure me that they were closing in on the man. But as the weeks stretched on, his words felt hollow.
Then, one evening, a knock came at the door. "Who is it?"
I called, my voice trembling. "It's Harris," came the familiar reply.
Relief washed over me as I unlocked the door.
But the moment it swung open, I realized my mistake. Harris stood there, but his expression wasn't reassuring, it was strained, almost apologetic. Before I could ask what was wrong, he stepped aside, revealing the man from the ferry standing just behind him.
My blood turned to ice.
"Hello, Sarah," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling.
How did you?"
"Enough," Harris interrupted, his tone sharp. He closed the door behind him, locking it.
"Sit down. Both of you."
I stared at him in disbelief.
"What's going on? Why is he here?"
Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"It's complicated. Sit down, and I'll explain." I didn't move. "I'm not sitting anywhere until you tell me what's happening."
The man smirked, clearly enjoying my confusion. "Sarah," Harris said, his voice softer now.
"This isn't what you think. He's not your enemy."
I blinked, my mind struggling to process his words.
"What?"
"He's undercover," Harris said. "An operative working to infiltrate the smuggling ring. The whole thing on the ferry, it was part of his mission."
I shook my head, disbelief and anger boiling over. "You expect me to believe that? After everything he did?"
The man stepped forward, his expression serious now.
"I had to play the part.
If you had exposed me, the entire operation would have been compromised." I backed away, my fists clenched.
"You terrorized me. You tried to kill me."
"I had to make it look real," he said.
"I never intended to hurt you. But you became a liability when you got too close."
Harris stepped between us, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "I know this is a lot to take in, but it's the truth. He's been working with us from the start." My knees felt weak, and I sank into a chair, my mind racing.
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"We couldn't risk it," Harris said.
"The fewer people who knew, the better."
I looked at the man, his face unreadable. Part of me wanted to believe them, to accept that this nightmare was part of some greater plan. But another part of me couldn't forget the fear, the pain, the chase through the storm. "I don't trust you," I said finally, my voice trembling.
"You don't have to," the man replied. "But if you want to stay alive, you'll listen.
The people we're after, they won't stop until we take them down.
And we need your help to do it."
The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and anger.
Help them? After everything I'd been through?
"Why should I trust you?" I said, my voice sharper now, cutting through the tension. I looked between Harris and the man, who both stood silently, their postures tense.
Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand why you're angry, Sarah. I really do. But this operation is bigger than you or me.
If we don't finish this, countless lives could be at risk.
That doesn't explain why you put me in harm's way. I snapped, my hands balling into fists. I didn't sign up for this.
I didn't choose to be a part of whatever game you're playing. The man, who still hadn't introduced himself, spoke up then, his tone measured but firm.
No one is saying you chose this. But you're in it now, whether you like it or not. And the people we're after already know who you are. If we don't work together, you'll never be safe.
His words struck a nerve, and I felt my resolve falter. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. The man from the ferry, the real enemy, was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves.
What exactly do you need me to do?
Harris and the man exchanged a glance, and I could see a flicker of relief in their expressions.
We need you to help us draw him out, Harris said. Draw him out? My voice rose an octave. You want to use me as bait?
It's not as reckless as it sounds, Harris replied quickly. We'll be with you every step of the way. You'll be protected, I promise. I shook my head, disbelief and anger swirling in my chest.
This is insane.
You want me to risk my life for a plan that might not even work? It will work, the man said, stepping closer. His gaze was intense, his voice steady.
We've been tracking his movements. He's looking for you, Sarah.
You're the only loose end he hasn't tied up.
If we give him the opportunity, he'll come to you. And then what?
I asked, my voice trembling.
What happens when he does?
We'll take him down, the man said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But he was calm, confident, and that only made me angrier. Why should I trust you?
I asked again.
He met my gaze, his expression unreadable.
Because you don't have another choice.
The plan was simple in theory, but the execution was anything but. Harris and his team arranged for me to return to a public location, an open-air cafe in the heart of the city. It was crowded, busy, and filled with potential witnesses. The perfect place to draw out the man who had been hunting me. The undercover operative, whom I reluctantly learned was named Logan, would be nearby, along with a team of plainclothes officers stationed at strategic points. Every precaution had been taken to ensure my safety, or so they claimed. As I sat at the cafe, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea, my nerves were frayed to their breaking point. My hands trembled as I glanced around, scanning the crowd for any sign of danger.
Relax, Logan's voice crackled in my earpiece. You're doing fine.
I resisted the urge to glare at the tiny microphone clipped to my collar.
Easy for you to say, I muttered under my breath.
Keep your eyes open, Harris chimed in.
He'll make his move soon.
I wasn't so sure. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the tension mounting with each fleeting glance from a stranger. And then I saw him. The man from the ferry stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes locked on me. My heart skipped a beat, and I fought the urge to bolt. Logan, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He's here. I see him, Logan replied calmly.
Stay where you are. Let him come to you.
My pulse raced as the man approached, his expression cold and calculating. He moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd until he stood just a few feet away. Sarah, he said, his voice low and smooth.
We meet again.
I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze.
What do you want?
You know what I want, he replied, his eyes narrowing. You should have stayed hidden.
Now, you've left me no choice.
Before I could respond, Logan's voice came through the earpiece. Stall him.
We're in position.
I took a shaky breath, my mind racing. You don't have to do this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The authorities already know everything. It's over. He smirked, a glint of menace in his eyes.
Oh, Sarah. It's far from over.
In a blur of motion, he reached for something under his jacket. But before he could act, Logan appeared behind him, his gun drawn. Don't move, Logan commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. The man froze, his hand hovering near his weapon. His eyes darted between me and Logan, calculating his odds.
"You think this changes anything?" he sneered.
"It changes everything," Logan replied.
Within seconds, the plainclothes officers swarmed the scene, subduing the man and disarming him.
The cafe erupted in a flurry of activity as the patrons realized what was happening. I watched in stunned silence as the man was handcuffed and led away, his expression unreadable. "It's over," Logan said, turning to me.
"You're safe now."
I wanted to believe him, but as I looked at the man being escorted to a waiting car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Even as the man was led away in handcuffs, the weight on my chest didn't lift. The moment felt surreal, like the climax of a movie where the villain was defeated and everything was supposed to return to normal. But life wasn't a movie, and I couldn't escape the gnawing sense that things were far from over. Logan approached me, his expression unreadable. "You did well," he said, his voice low.
"Better than most would in your situation."
I didn't respond, still staring at the spot where the man had been standing moments earlier. "Sarah," Logan said, his tone softening.
"It's over.
You're safe." I looked at him, searching for any cracks in his calm exterior, but he seemed as solid as ever.
"Is it really over?"
I asked, my voice trembling.
"Because it doesn't feel like it."
He hesitated, a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, crossing his face. The man we captured was a key player, but he wasn't the top of the chain. This operation isn't finished yet, but his capture buys us time.
"It buys you time." "Time for what?"
I asked, the weight of his words sinking in.
"To wait for the next person to come after me?"
Logan sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"No one's coming after you. We've taken every precaution to ensure your safety." "But you can't guarantee it, can you?"
I said, my voice rising. "You're asking me to trust you, but every step of the way, I've been left in the dark. How am I supposed to believe this is over when I'm the one who has to live with the consequences?" Logan opened his mouth to respond, but Harris interrupted, his voice calm but firm.
"Sarah, I understand your frustration. But this man's arrest is a turning point.
We've dismantled a large part of the smuggling ring, and his intel will lead us to the rest."
"You've done your part. Then why don't I feel relieved?"
I asked, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. Harris and Logan exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them.
Finally, Harris nodded. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said. "We'll talk more once the dust settles." The next few days passed in a haze.
I was moved to another safe house, this one quieter, more secluded. The constant presence of officers outside the door became a familiar comfort, though it did little to ease the tension coiling in my chest. I tried to fall back into a routine, but the events of the past weeks haunted me. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window set my nerves on edge. Sleep came in fleeting, restless bursts, my dreams plagued by the man's cold, calculating eyes. Logan visited occasionally, his presence a strange mix of reassurance and frustration. He never stayed long, always leaving with vague promises that everything was under control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he arrived with an envelope in hand.
"What's that?" I asked, eyeing it warily.
"Closure," he said, setting it on the table. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling as I pulled out the contents. Inside was a photograph of the man from the ferry, along with a short report detailing his capture and transfer to a high-security prison.
"He won't be bothering you again," Logan said, his tone firm.
I stared at the photo, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, anger, fear, it was all there, fighting for dominance.
"Is it really over?"
I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.
Logan nodded. "It is. You can finally move on." "Move on."
The words felt hollow, almost mocking.
How was I supposed to move on from something like this?
"Thank you," I said finally, though the words felt inadequate. Logan gave me a small, almost hesitant smile.
"You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't forget that."
Months passed, and slowly, life began to regain a semblance of normalcy. The safe house became a distant memory, replaced by a small apartment in a new city. I found a job, made friends, and tried to rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. But the scars remained, invisible to the outside world but ever present in my mind. I couldn't walk into a crowded room without scanning for exits, couldn't hear footsteps behind me without tensing. One day, as I sat in a cafe, sipping my coffee and watching the world go by, I felt a familiar unease creep over me. A man stood across the street, watching me. My heart raced as I froze, my mind flashing back to the ferry, the storm, the chase. But when he turned and walked away, I realized something. I wasn't the same person I had been before. This time, I wasn't going to run. Life after the ordeal wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I fought every day to reclaim it, piece by piece, memory by memory. But the shadow of what had happened followed me like an unwelcome guest. I never truly felt alone, no matter how much I wanted to. The man watching me from across the street had been a false alarm, just a stranger who happened to glance in my direction. But the feeling it left behind lingered. I couldn't shake the sense that someone, somewhere, might still be keeping tabs on me. One evening, I returned home after work, the weight of the day pressing on my shoulders. The new city I'd moved to was vibrant and bustling, a place where anonymity came easily. But the quiet of my apartment sometimes felt like a vacuum, amplifying my thoughts and fears. I set my bag down and locked the door behind me. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but something felt off. The air was different. Still, heavy. I scanned the room, my heart beginning to race. Nothing looked out of place, but the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I moved cautiously through the apartment, checking each room. The windows were locked, the doors secure. But the feeling wouldn't leave. As I returned to the living room, my eyes landed on something that hadn't been there before, a small envelope on the coffee table. My blood ran cold. I approached it slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn and run. But curiosity, or perhaps defiance, pushed me forward. The envelope was plain, unmarked. My hands shook as I opened it and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. "We're not finished yet." The words were scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting. My stomach churned as I read them over and over, disbelief warring with terror. Who had left this? How had they gotten in? I grabbed my phone and dialed the number Harris had given me months ago, my fingers fumbling over the keys. "Detective Harris," his voice answered after a few rings.